Some of this stuff we've already discussed. A lot of this early history, I'm just going to kind of skim through it real quick, talking about briefly the Native Americans that lived in the whole area of Suwannee County, including the Dowling Park area. The Timucua, those that were here when Europeans arrived. Hunters, farmers, hunter-gatherers, all that kind of stuff. But they also did a lot of farming and lived in villages and such. All right, Europeans arrived here in Florida in the 1500s in the interior of Suwannee County. Felipe de Narvaez and his expedition in 1529, I believe, were the first ones here. And I'm going to say 1529, and I'm probably wrong. 1528, I was close. So arrived in 1528, and they came through this area, possibly even through the Dowling Park area. We just don't know for sure exactly where they came through. They did cross the Suwannee River, that's fairly confident, based on the descriptions of the survivors. One of the 6 survivors, or 4 survivors of that group, not many, out of their 400 folks. But they crossed through there. They had the first recorded drowning on the Suwannee River. It could have been around Dowling Park, could have been Charles Springs, could have been further up, we just don't know, but somewhere in that area. And then a decade later, 1539, Hernando de Soto came through. He crossed also the Suwannee River, possibly around Charles Springs, what we now know today anyway is Charles Springs. But it could have been around Dowling Park. We just don't know about that either. So again, with this stuff we've talked about in a lot more detail in some of the previous presentations. It's just kind of an introduction to the Dowling Park area that we're talking about today. Spanish period, we've also discussed in some detail several mission sites that were established around Suwannee County. The closest one to what's now Dowling Park was probably San Juan de la Cara, which was established there at Charles Springs, which is a few miles downriver, but that was probably the closest mission site to Dowling Park today. And these lasted for about 100 years from their establishment, usually in the early 1600s. They usually lasted until about the late 1600s, or in some cases the very early 1700s before they were destroyed by the English, or they were abandoned or consolidated. So if there was one around Dowling Park, the one at Charles Springs was probably the closest one, which there was one there for sure. So then we move into the early American history. Again, we've already talked about this before. I don't want to belabor it, but we have the Spanish giving Florida to the British after the end of the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. That's one of the trade-offs in exchange for Cuba, which Spain wants back more than Florida. So that's for about a 20-year period. England or Great Britain at that point owns Florida. At the end of the American Revolution, which is a worldwide war, not just focused here on the colonies, but at the end of that war, Great Britain wants some of its Caribbean islands back that have been captured by the Spanish and the French, those sugar-rich or sugarcane-rich islands. So they say, hey, give those back and we'll give you Florida back. So Spain gets Florida back at the end of 1783. They are there for a few decades. Pretty much there's nobody here in this area, including the Dowling Park area, and they are the only folks living here are the Seminole Native Americans. This is Osceola, not chief, but he was Osceola, a war leader from a later time period, but they lived in this area in the late 1700s and early 1800s. Well, by 1820-ish, we start getting our first American settlers into what's now Suwannee County. One of the first being Reuben and Rebecca Charles, who established a ferry and inn, etc., down at what's now Charles Springs, named in their honor. And so gradually there are Americans that are moving into this county. The Seminoles are still here, and they don't always get along. So we have what is called the Second Seminole War. The First Seminole War happened in 1819, basically, a very brief thing. But in the 1830s and early 1840s, we've got the Second Seminole War, and some of the battles, if you will, it's more massacres, happened around Suwannee County, although most of the true battles happened down in central Florida and beyond. But this is a map from 1836 and 1837, written by a guy named Mott, I believe, wrote a book. So by this point, again, we've got settlers. We've got a few trading posts. We've got some roads coming through. We also have a few ferries because of that. We've got Charles Ferry down here. Then we've got Livingston's Ferry up in this neighborhood. Now, even before that time, there was a J.W. Robarts who had a ferry in operation starting in 1831, and it was defined as being between Charles Ferry down here and the Withlacoochee River here. So somewhere between there. That's all the description I have found so far. But it's very possible it was here at Livingston's Ferry, which was pretty close to Dowling Park. But either way, by 1833, Thomas Livingston operated this ferry kind of in the Dowling Park region, not right there, but close by. There's a description I've got from the Civil War, or right before the Civil War, and it lists it as being, quote, 5 miles south of the confluence of the Withlacoochee and Suwannee, and 10 miles upriver from Charles Ferry. So we have a little bit more specifics to that one. So it's 10 miles upriver from Charles Ferry and 5 miles downriver from the Withlacoochee and the Suwannee, where the Suwannee River State Park is. So that puts it closer to Dowling Park. But this shows those two major roads that came through Suwannee County during the Second Seminole War. The St. Augustine Pensacola Highway, and then the Jacksonville Pensacola route. This is Stagecoach pretty much today. We call it County Road 132. I grew up knowing it as Stagecoach Road. And this pretty much does not exist per se, although you can find bits and pieces of it when you go out to the fields and such. But these were the two major roads coming through Suwannee County in the 1830s and the 1840s. This map is from 1872 after the Civil War, and it also shows Livingston's, as it calls it, but Livingston's Ferry. They're close to where Dowling Park is. Now then, there were other ferry crossings that were basically in the Dowling Park area, including one called Horton's Ferry. It was approved in late 1879 by the county commissioners here in Suwannee County, and it was given to John J. Horton. Now, its description was 9 miles downriver from the ferry at Columbus, which is the Suwannee River State Park now, and 8 miles upriver from the Mosley Mill Ferry. So this description puts it right there, basically in Dowling Park. I believe they have a marker on the river where that ferry was located. So Horton's Ferry was actually in Dowling Park, not just that area, but actually in modern day Dowling Park. This is not a picture, excuse me, not a picture of that actual one. This is the Ivy Brothers, which had established a ferry in what we now call Branford. But it gives you a good idea of how much things cost to go across the river. Now, we didn't really have bridges. We didn't have bridges as we have today. If you wanted to get across the river, you had to either have your own boat, which was very rare, or own canoe or whatever, or you had to pay a ferryman to take you across the river. So it was not free to travel from one county to the other. So if you had a 6-horse wagon, it was going to cost you $1. I mean, that's probably like $50 today. It goes all the way down to sheep, goats, and hogs. Each one you took over was a penny. So it could add up. A man and a horse was 10 cents. So one of the many reasons people didn't travel a lot was I guess it's the equivalent of paying for gasoline today. You had to pay to just go across the river. So you got to pay this guy to do that. But it's interesting to have. We have a lot of those kind of records from the 1870s and 1880s, especially, of some of these ferries and how much they charged, kind of where they were, who operated them. It's kind of fascinating. And the ferries were basically like this one here. This is Irvin's Ferry down at Lurville in the 1880s, but all the other ferries would have been very similar. You've got a flat-bottomed, it's not a boat really, but it's a flat-bottomed flotation device, if you will, with a flat top. You'd have some guardrails to make sure people didn't fall off the sides. You would have a ferryman, like this gentleman here, who could be actually Washington Irvin himself. And you'd have usually a metal cable running from both sides of the river, across the river. And you would basically just float across using the current to help push you one way or the other, and using that pole and guide wire to make sure you didn't float downriver. And that's basically how they operated. You would go up to the ferry owner's house, which was right next to the ferry usually, you would tell him, hey, Bob, I need to go. And you pay him, and he'd take you across. So that's pretty much how all these ferries operated. And I think even up until the 1950s, there was a ferry down in, I'm trying to remember which county it was. One of the ones further south, Gilchrist or Levy, one of those counties, because I've got a picture at the office of them taking like a 55 Chevy or something over on one of these ferries. It's kind of funny to see. But I mean, this was what people would do before vehicles came around and they started building vehicle bridges, early 1900s. This is actually a picture of the Dowling Park Ferry in 1906. So you see you've got that bend of the river there, and that's very similar. Again, it's harder to tell. This is from a postcard, but similar thing. Just it's got a wire across and you go over. So as we're moving ahead, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, because our records of the Dowling Park area, I won't say are complete, because like a lot of places that I talk about, they did not have a government. Unlike Live Oak or even Branford, and to a small extent Welborn, they didn't have city government or town government. So I know a lot more about those communities, the details of the communities, because we've got minute books from the city. We've got some minute books from Branford Town Council, those kinds of things. So I can determine a lot more information. Dowling Park, or what is now Dowling Park, did not have that. So there are gaps in our records. You can go through deed books and such and see where people bought property. You can go through, look at certain court cases if you know what names to look through. But there are a lot of gaps in all of our history of Suwannee County, to be honest. People just didn't keep records, and they didn't have, it was hard to take a picture. You couldn't just go pull your camera out on your phone and take a picture or something. And if you did have a picture made, it was very time consuming and expensive, and the ravages of time had probably destroyed them. Plus people writing down. Not everybody could write. Not everybody could read. I was looking up some records yesterday for a gentleman, and some of the family, it was X, make your mark. And this was the late 1800s and early 1900s. So even at that, people are not able to always read or write, so they're not able to pass on their family history down in a way that we can see them today or read them today. So there are gaps. But what we do know is this is an 1891 map of Suwannee County, and you can see several railroads like this one here, and going down here, the major railroads. You've got roads. Here's another railroad over here. But you can see Hudson on the Suwannee, or Hudson upon the Suwannee. That was the name of the community that we know of today as Dowling Park. Best I can guess, looking at the maps from before and after this, probably established about 1880. Again, we don't know for sure. It was pretty much just somebody started living there, and then more people started living there, and oh, let's build a store, let's build a this and that. But by around 1880, Hudson upon the Suwannee was established there on the river, where Horton's Ferry basically was, and other ferries had been or close by in the years. Charles Ferry's down around here. So people just grew that community. So, taking a pause from that to move over a little bit into Suwannee County to Live Oak, around 1888, Thomas Dowling was born in Hamilton County in the 1850s, 1851, but in 1888 he moved to Live Oak. He established a sawmill, lumber mill, those kinds of things, not only in Lake City, but over here in Suwannee County, in Live Oak, just kind of behind where the Brown Lantern is today. So north of the railroad tracks. In that area was where his sawmill was established. So he started those operations, and he started cutting out the timber that was still around Live Oak at that point. And he was one of several sawmill operators in Live Oak in the late 1800s. Live Oak was growing by leaps and bounds in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and he was just one of the men that was taking advantage of that. So he built that lumber mill, that planing mill. And so these are a couple pictures that I have found in different books and different publications of him as a younger man and as an older gentleman. So he became pretty well off, especially for the time. He was able to build a nice house there on the east side of Live Oak on Duval Street and Georgia Avenue. And of course, that house still exists today. 406 on Duval is what it's called, the restaurant, those kinds of things. But it is just outside of downtown Live Oak, the downtown area. You can walk there from the courthouse if you really wanted to. I don't, but you can. You can. But he built that house. It was built by 1896. I don't know at a specific date. That's another one of those things that's hard to tell sometimes. But he had built it by 1896 because the valuation on that property showed obviously a nice house on it because of how much he was paying in taxes. It actually, this nice, beautiful, huge columns that are here, that was not original to the house. Originally, apparently, from the records I've seen and the stories I've read, he had basically porches on the top and bottom floors, like a lot of other houses of that era. But pretty much what happened was, as the story goes, one of his sons, I believe, had a suitor, or he was trying to impress this daughter's dad and daughter's family. So Thomas Dowling said, all right, I'll take down these porches and put these huge columns here. So it was basically to impress a kid's, hopefully spouse-to-be. And it seemed to work. They're still there. It's nice. It's beautiful. Over the years, it was lived in by many different people. It kind of went run down for a while, but then in the late 1990s, early 2000s, it was renovated, restored, and restaurants have been opened in there pretty much since then. So Thomas Dowling is making a lot of money from the railroad and the timber business, those kinds of things. He builds the first water tower there across the street in Live Oak, which is still there today, although it's no longer operating, and that's sad. But that water tower he builds in 1897, pretty much so his house can have running water. And then he starts leasing or renting out the water to other folks. And after about 5 or 6 years, the city buys up the waterworks, and that becomes part of the public works of Live Oak. So as part of this timber business, as he's cutting out the timber right there around his sawmill and planing mills in Live Oak, they need access to the timber. So they start building, he and his family, R.L. Dowling and Sons, started basically building a timber railroad, a short line timber railroad, so they could access the timber that's getting further and further away from them. So they start building this gradually heading westward, and they just continue to build westward. They are connecting that line to the two major lines in Live Oak at the time, which would become the ACL, the Atlantic Coast Line, and also the Seaboard Air Line. Prior to that, when he's actually building it, it's part of the plant system and the Florida Central and Peninsular. So those are the two major regional railroads that go throughout the southeast pretty much. And this lumber railroad is connecting to them, makes it easier to transport that timber. So by the turn of the century, the 1900-ish, that railroad, R.L. Dowling and Sons Railroad, gets all the way to Hudson upon the Suwannee, where there's still a lot of virgin timber to be had. And the Dowling family uses that opportunity to keep using that timber. In the meantime, as they're continuing to use that timber, they even go beyond that into Lafayette County and beyond. But then they decide to incorporate a railroad, and this is a whole story in and of itself. But basically, there's lots of competition between the Dowling family, the Drew family, and several other families and groups, all trying to get a lot of railroad service into Suwannee County and the surrounding regions. So what happens basically is the Dowling family and others get together and they establish what's called the Live Oak and Perry Railroad, the LO&P. And that is established in 1903, but there are problems with that original charter. And so then in 1906, they redo the charter and rename the railroad the Live Oak, Perry, and Gulf Railroad. Because then they start buying up the Live Oak and Gulf Railroad. We've talked about this before also in one of the presentations. All of these various railroads we've had over the years in Suwannee County. Very similar sounding ones like the Live Oak and Perry, the Live Oak and Gulf, the Live Oak, Perry, and Gulf. So this is the Live Oak Parian Gulf is what it becomes. So that railroad brings even more business into Hudson upon the Suwannee and then brings it back to Live Oak and beyond. Meanwhile, we've got Hudson upon the Suwannee, but then because of the Dowlings and their sawmill, in the early 1900s, about around 1904 or 5, Hudson upon the Suwannee is renamed Dowling Park, or Dowlings Park, in honor of that family that has done so much for it. This is one of the homes that was there in the early 1900s. I don't know who the people are in front of it. It's possible they were boarding house workers that were working in that huge sawmill that had hundreds of people there, cutting thousands of feet of timber. This house actually still stands there today on County Road 250. If you drive going towards the Abbott Christian Village on 250, it'll be on the right before you get to the entrance. I think it got flooded here last month, but the house is still there. It's been updated a little bit, but that's basically still there. So, going back to the Live Oak Parian Gulf Railroad and this competition between the others, again, especially the Drew family. It seems like the Drews and the Dowlings don't get along. They're both in the railroad and timber industry. They're trying to buy up each other's property, each other's sawmills. But basically, the Atlantic coastline gets involved, and they help to fund the Live Oak Parian Gulf. They're friends of the Dowling family. They hate the Drew family. And so they are able to provide a lot of money into Live Oak Parian Gulf. So that allows the LOP&G to go all the way to Perry and even beyond. They keep extending it along and along, because the ACL, the Atlantic Coastline, is one of those two huge railroad companies, and they've got the money to do it. Meanwhile, the Drew family is languishing with their own railroads because these big wigs aren't supporting them. Granted, the Drews have not made nice with them too, so it's a whole fun, interesting story. But let's see. By 1907, the LOP&G had 90 curves in it, which were about 10 miles worth, and then about 50 miles of straight track. They had two wooden railroad bridges. One of them was 30 feet long, the other 100 feet long, and those were over Spring Creek and the Finn Holloway rivers. And they had 80 different trestles. The longest was over here in Suwannee County, going from the Suwannee County over to Lafayette at Dowling Park, and that was 1,800 feet long. That was the longest trestle of LOP&G. Let's see. They had a couple competitors, like the South Georgia Railroad from Adel, Georgia, and the Suwannee and San Pedro. Suwannee and San Pedro was one of those owned by the Drew family, but then, they got bought up and bought out and transferred and all kinds of different stuff. But LOP&G was still doing well for many years. For its first few decades, it was still doing great, especially after the Drew family's railroad collapsed. They had to shut down, and all that logging and all those commercial items being transferred, a lot of it came over to LOP&G. So LOP&G was able to continue on. They had preferential agreements with the ACL, those kinds of things. So LOP&G did a lot to help grow Dowling Park because of its access going right through Dowling Park. Dowling Park, like a lot of these other communities that I talk about, even some that don't exist today, they were platted out, subdivided into various blocks and lots. This is the one of Dowling Park. One of the records says it's 1906 or circa 1906. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but that's what it says, so I'll just say that's what it says. It may have been a little bit later than that when this was drawn, but basically it's showing Dowling Park with grandiose ideas of how big it was going to be. Pretty much none of this ever really came to fruition. This was, it might have been a lot, 8 or 10 lots or more. Down here you got like 15 lots per block, but none of these blocks ever really went anywhere. If you go out there today, you will see some roads, and those roads, maybe some of these still exist, but these other lots and these blocks are nothing. They're just all bought up by the same folks, never improved upon, and so much of what you see here is this subdivision of Dowling Park never went anywhere. Most of the subdivision and stuff was up here, where the Advent Christian Village, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, popped up. But that is the plat. You can see the Live Oak Parian Gulf Railroad line coming through here and coming across there. So, Dowling Park, again, originally Hudson upon the Suwannee, named after the Dowling family. It continued to grow. By 1910, the federal census showed there were almost 1,000 people living there in Dowling Park, and a lot of them were the sawmill workers and related functions to the sawmill. Dowling Park had 3 company stores, and this is one of those things where pretty much the Dowling Lumber Company owned all these different businesses. And so you would not necessarily get paid in dollars. You would get paid in coupons, if you will, that you could use at the company store, those kinds of things. So it was a way to keep business within that company. And Dowling's Lumber Company was not the only one that did that. A lot of other big companies did that throughout the United States. But basically, they had these company stores. They had a hotel. There was a post office. There was a drugstore. There were several private stores owned by residents. There was a railroad depot. There were 4 churches, and then a lumber administration building. There were also, according to that census and others of that era, other records, there were 73 houses for just the lumber workers and a lot of prominent homes, like some of these nice ones along the river. Beautiful homes. And this was the Suwannee County side. Now, directly across, pretty much over here in this bend, was the Dowling Park, the hotel that was owned by the family and the group over there. But it was a beautiful hotel. I'll show you a picture in just a minute. But there was the hotel, there were swimming pools, there was a bowling alley, landscape yards. Visitors from all around the world would come to Dowling Park and to go to that hotel. This early 1900s era, this late 1800s, and especially early 1900s, say the first decade of the 1900s, you see a lot of folks coming to Suwannee County and the surrounding areas. We've got these sulfur springs especially. And at that point, people think the sulfur heals you of all kinds of stuff. So we've got hotels at Suwannee Springs. We've got hotels at Dowling Park. White Springs over in Hamilton County has several hotels. People coming from all around the world to relax, to enjoy nature, and to try to heal themselves of whatever ailment they've got. And Dowling Park's hotel is no different. Lots of advertisements for hotels of the area, things that can cure you from rheumatoid arthritis to women issues, is what they said anyway. So Dowling Park was no different, but that hotel and those related facilities helped Dowling Park to be a vibrant community in the early 1900s and allowed people to build houses like this there on the right-hand side. There's another picture of, I believe that's Robert Dowling himself in 1910. So again, on the river, nice, beautiful home. Another view. So Dowling Park was still a lot of wooded area, still a lot of nature, but it was a vibrant community of 1,000 folks in 1910. Within, say by the 1920s, Suwannee County's got lots of different railroads. The teens, and going in the 20s, we've got lots of railroads. I showed you a few of them on a map, but there's even more than that that I didn't show you on the map. But lots of railroads, lots of depots related to those railroads, lots of stops along them. For instance, the LOP&G comes from Live Oak, goes to Dowling Park. In between that, there are about 5 stops. Places that no longer exist, like Mercer, Star, Lancaster. You might have, there's a Lancaster Road today. That's the only reason probably anybody's ever heard of it. But there were several stops. Now, the depots were not necessarily this nice. They might have just been a very small building, like an outhouse kind of building. Not much to it. But this one was probably, from the records that I've been able to see, this is probably the Dowling Park depot. Circa 1910. See the top of the line vehicles that they were driving then. But this is one of the railroads. This is the LOP&G, and this is one of the railroads that would come through. That would have box cars for carrying cargo, but also passengers over here. As a sign of the times, and this is obvious from a lot of old photographs, if you can zoom in far enough, if you look over here, there's different entrances, one for the, as it says, white, and one for colored, as it says. The picture's good enough quality you can zoom into even that. But of course, that's product of the times. But this was basically the Dowling Park railroad depot for the LOPNG. So this was the Park Hotel in Dowling Park, again located not in Suwannee County but across the river, but it was all tied together. They were all connected and all dealing with each other. One of those major resorts, lots of amenities in it. And this is a 1904 Suwannee Democrat advertisement about Dowling's White Sulphur Park. So you can see how the name eventually got shortened to Dowling Park. So they went through a lot of variations of the name, but Dowling's White Sulphur Park. So I'll read it to you. If you have not already visited this ideal spot, you should do so at once. One of the most beautiful parks to be found anywhere in Florida is to be seen at this place immediately on the banks of the Suwannee River, where nature has done the work in beautifying this spot. The river makes a great circle, leaving a plot of ground with about 100 acres in the shape of a horseshoe on which the park is located, with its huge oaks and cliffs of rocks, where you will find the finest sulfur water in the state of Florida. And adding to the pleasure of this beautiful spot, you will find a fine bathing pool filled with the sparkling sulfur water. You know it had to stink, but that was supposed to be good for you. You will also find a good hotel where you can get a first-class meal at any time. Also a number of beautiful cottages which can be rented for $4 per week, nicely furnished. Man, I wish it was still like that. You will find also bowling alleys and other attractions. 2 large, nicely arranged pavilions where both ladies and gentlemen can enjoy themselves. Refreshments served at all times. Those wishing a quiet rest for a few days can find no better place. And this part is very funny. Absolutely no mosquitoes or other insects to bother day or night. That was a big selling point back then. Special cheap rate of 50 cents from Live Oak, 40 cents from Star, 35 cents from Mercer, 30 cents from Platte, 25 cents from Lancaster. So those are those stops. I've mentioned most of those already. From Live Oak to Dowling Park. Let's see. For any information regarding cottages, hotel accommodations, etc., apply to R.L. Dowling or A.J. Skipper, agent, Live Oak and Perry Railroad, Live Oak, Florida. Now this is before it became Live Oak Perry North Railroad. So just it's interesting to see these in some old newspapers. And this was not why I've got the newspaper. I've got that newspaper there at the courthouse because somewhere in that newspaper there was maybe a tax deed sale or foreclosure, some kind of listings where they had to keep a proof of publication. And I got lucky because somebody got lazy, and instead of cutting out the notice like they did usually, they just said, "Add the heck with it," and just threw the whole newspaper in the record. So I get fun stuff like this sometimes. So Dowling's Park, or Dowling Park, built up by Thomas Dowling and his family. Most of the property, most of the land was owned by the Dowling family, specifically Thomas Dowling, who owned thousands of acres in Suwannee County. He starts to get into bad health in the late 1900, like 1908, 09, 1910. He starts to get into bad health. And Richard Sears of Sears and Roebuck starts purchasing up property, this cut out timber, because he wants to use it to sell in their catalog, the Sears and Roebuck catalog. And what better way to do it than just start buying up this property and then selling it for their own profit also. So he buys up a lot of Thomas Dowling's cutout timberlands in Suwannee County. And he also then eventually buys up the Dowling Lumber Mill and those related buildings, changes the name to the Standard Lumber Company, and creates a new company just to sell that cutout land, that cut over land, to folks. And it is called the Suwannee River Land Belt Company. Originally, they were selling that cutout. It was cleared, basically. That cleared land was going for 26 cents per acre through the Sears catalog and through the railroad agents, because they would say, "Hey, you want some land? I know where some land is. It's already cut." So they were selling it. And that Suwannee River Land Belt Company operated for about 50 years, a little bit more than 50 years, 55 years. They shut down finally in 1965. And in that time period, nearly 10,000 cells have been completed. So 10,000 cells selling some 100,000 acres, not just in Suwannee, but also surrounding counties. So 10,000 cells, 100,000 acres. People all around the world. People are buying this stuff sight unseen. I've got some records from folks, say Australia or England or whatever. They're buying up this property sometimes. Never seen it. Just based on, hey, it's from Sears and Roebuck catalog, or I've heard there's some timber, cut out timber property, I'll buy it up. So people from all over the world are buying this up. So Thomas Dowling, again, he's been in failing health. He dies on June 13th, 1911 at the age of 60, and he's buried in the Live Oak City Cemetery. This is him with some of his grandkids, who maybe are pretending to be cowboys. Hard to tell from the quality of the photo. So, I was talking about earlier the ferries that crossed the Suwannee River for many years, but gradually by the early 1900s we've got automobiles that have come into the scene. People are starting to buy them up. Thomas Dowling buying one of the first ones, to be honest, in Suwannee County in Florida. But people are starting to buy up these cars, and they realize, we can't use ferries for these. It's not very economical. It's not very efficient. So they start building the first of 3 or 4 generations now, I guess we're in the 4th generation, of bridges. The early 1900s through about 1915 or so is that first generation of vehicle bridge building in Suwannee County. Because before that, the only bridges were pretty much just the railroad bridges. And then for everything else, you use ferries for. This is the Dowling Park, the first bridge at Dowling Park across the Suwannee River. It was built eventually in 1913. They almost had started building one in 1906. It just didn't work out, funding and other things. So it took a lot of years. And when you go through the county commission minutes, you see a lot of those mentions. There's not as much discussion as I would have loved as a historian, but they talk about building one. But then they get petitions from the Dowling Park residents. Hey, we need one. The county says, this sounds good, let's look at it, but then they never actually do it until 1913. So they build this one, and it's got a lot of support from Lafayette County since it crosses over there. So it's basically a half and half. Suwannee pays for half, Lafayette County pays for the other half. So that's the first vehicle bridge in Dowling Park, which again allows better service to the folks, but also allows better transportation of things like the sawmill, things from the sawmill. So this was the Dowling sawmill that became the Standard Company's sawmill that employed hundreds of workers in what's now pretty much the Advent Christian Village. And it closed finally in 1929. It just was no longer economically feasible to keep it running. And then it burned down in 1930. They were talking about reopening it, but then it burned, so oops. But this picture is circa 1910, showing that sawmill, kind of a panoramic view of the sawmill. And over there in the back right, you'll see some of the logs that have been cut. The timber's been cut, so this is probably a better view of it. And again, the one in Dowling Park from the Dowling Company was not the only sawmill in Suwannee County. Live Oak had a ton, Branford, even Louisville and Welborn and other places. Pretty much every community at one point had some kind of sawmill. Might not have been as big as the Dowling one, but they had a sawmill. So you could have seen this in lots of places in the late 1800s and early 1900s. You would have seen something like this as they cut out all that timber and that they formed it in the boards. Just look how far it goes down. I mean, that's a lot of timber they've been cutting and trimming. And this is one of their mechanical, the first kind of mechanical, I guess you could call it kind of a forklift type thing, but it moved this timber from one place to the other. It is called a Ross lumber carrier, first built in 1913. It could lift 12,000 pounds, much better than any guy could move, and so it was very indispensable when you were moving stuff like this at sawmills. But this picture is basically taken at what's now Park in the Pines Mobile Home Park in Advent Christian Village. So pretty much where some of these aisles are, these rows, these are some of the streets of that mobile home park today. So that kind of shows you where it is. So again, Thomas Dowling's in bad health. Mr. Sears starts buying up a lot of the cutout timber, but Thomas Dowling still has a lot of property that he owns. And so what happens is, shortly before his death in 1911, he is an Advent Christian gentleman. Bird Bixler here is the preacher in Live Oak, but he has lots of connections all over the place. So Thomas Dowling basically donates 400 acres of property in Dowling Park for an Advent Christian campground. They want to establish a campground for folks to come to. And so it's kind of basically in care of Bird Bixler. The campground really does not get off. That just doesn't go anywhere. But Bird Bixler in 1912 is contacted asking if there's a place where they can have orphans live. So he's able to work his magic, able to talk to a lot of folks, get a lot of funding, and so they basically set up an orphanage, the Advent Christian Village and Orphanage. And so that is how the ACV gets started. It becomes, basically it starts out as not only an orphan's home, but also a place for, I believe the quotation is, old and worn out ministers. So it's a retirement home, retirement center, and orphanage for those of the Advent Christian faith. The first kids arrive in 1913, and the first retirees arrive in 1914 as they're building places for them to live, those kinds of things. So by 1919, after just a few years of operation, there are 50 kids and then 12 retirees living there. And Bird Bixler is kind of the guy that spearheads this. By this point, Thomas Dowling has died. But Bird Bixler picked this up and moved on. He's also, besides being a minister, he's into politics a little bit. A lot of civic stuff for sure. He also publishes his own newspaper. He dies in 1950. When he dies, Live Oak in Suwannee County shuts down basically in honor of him. They closed the schools even in honor of him. He did a lot for Suwannee County, and specifically Dowling Park via the Advent Christian Village. So this is basically the original, if not the original, one of the original buildings at the Advent Christian Village. And this was built in 1913. This is kind of the children's dormitory. So you had a place where the matron could stay. You have a place for the children to stay. And you also have like a guest suite, if you will, for visitors or retirees to come by. So this building lasted for just a dozen years. On December 23rd, 1925, it burns down. All the kids' Christmas gifts are burnt with it. So these destitute kids, already they're orphans. They don't have any parents, those kinds of things. They now have no Christmas presents. So the community bands together. They're able to buy presents for these kids. They have a nice Christmas. And then they rebuild a brick building this time, but basically rebuild a brick building on the same site. These are some of the first orphans at the Advent Christian Village. This picture was done in 1916. So again, it shows them on the banks of the Suwannee River. The Park Hotel would have been over here in this area. LOP&G, we've talked about. Now the Florida Railway, which was the one owned by the Drew family, it basically shuts down in 1916. They are not able to pay their creditors. They're not able to pay their employees. And so the Florida Railway shuts down. Even the employees are starting to tear up the tracks. I mean, that's how bad it gets. Mr. Drew, the owner at the time, he is afraid to go out at night or about any time because he's had threats on his life. So with the Florida Railway shutting down, the Live Oak Pier and Gulf is able to bring in more passengers, more agricultural stuff, more timber, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So again, it helps. It's a boon to the LOP&G when the Florida Railway shuts down, their main short line competitor. And I did not mention this earlier. I've got to mention it. The LOP&G, because it was built as a timber railroad originally. When you're doing those kinds of things, you're basically building something as cheaply as possible to get from point A with the timber to point B where the sawmill is. So the LOP&G is not the most comfortable of rides when they just extend it and continue it on as a general carrier and passenger service. So there's lots of bumps, there's lots of issues, and again, it was kind of cheaply made, to be honest. And so it's the LOP&G, the Lopen Gopher, because of all the gopher holes they talk about it hits on the way, and also LOP&G living on peas and grits, because it's cheaply done. It's cheap. So they couldn't afford anything better. They're living on peas and grits. So those are two of the nicknames for the LOP&G. If you go to the Abbot Christian Village today, I believe their restaurant is called the Lopen Gopher, and that's why it's in honor of this railroad. I had to mention that with an LOP&G discussion. So again, the demise of the Florida Railway is down here, allows the LOP&G to continue, and they start to get some of the traffic that was coming from down here comes up by the LOP&G. So that definitely helps out the LOP&G. So this is a map of Suwannee County in 1920. You can still see the Florida Railway, but it's not active. I guess whoever drew this didn't realize, okay, that railroad is shut down, but they've actually been tearing up the line by this point, so it's no longer there. But you can see, again, the two major east-west and the north-south running regional railroads, the SAL, the Seaboard Airline, and the Atlantic Coast Line coming north and south. The old Florida Railway that's shut down. You've got this White Springs Railroad, Suwannee River White Springs Railroad, which is a short one. But then you've got, again, the LOP&G, Star, Mercer, Platte, Lancaster, Dowling Park, and then on into Lafayette County. A lot of the early communities are gone. Lots of communities over the years in Suwannee County. I'm chairman of the Historical Commission, and we have documented over 100 communities at least. I've got a map that we had done, but I didn't bring it here, but documented lots of communities. Most of them by the early 1900s are gone, and to be honest, most of these on this map are no more than a few houses, maybe a store. Not much to them. All right, as we're in the early 1900s, in this era, I've got to bring up Ruby Strickland. Now then, we can be honest with ourselves and say that throughout most of history, the history is written by men, usually, about men. Not a lot of women mentioned in the history books. Not a lot of women that have been mentioned of the things they do, because usually a lot of times, back in the day, if you will, their work was more behind the scenes, to be honest, in most cases. Ruby Strickland was not one of those ladies. I see Ernie back there. You probably remember Miss Ruby. Yeah. But she was born in Reynolds, Georgia, 1886. Her father was Wiley Jordan. She had at least 4 siblings. In 1898, the family moved to Live Oak. But then, shortly thereafter, her father, Wiley, became postmaster of Dowling Park. So he did that basically in 1906, operated as the postmaster for a couple of years, and then he decided to become a traveling salesman. So by that point, Ruby Strickland is a very young adult, or Ruby Jordan at that point still. She's a young adult. She basically is put in as postmistress in his place. So she's 22 years old, and she is installed as postmistress of Dowling Park in 1909. She only served for a couple of years herself before she married Dr. Henry Maddox Strickland. So she gets married to a doctor, and then she moves back to Live Oak, which is where she lives for several decades. They have a daughter, Frances Alberta, later married a Hare, so that's who Ernie knew. She was born in 1913, but Ruby was very active. She was not the typical stay at home and just stay at home and do nothing. I mean, she did some of that obviously too, but she also was very active in social circles. She was part of the Live Oak Women's Club. She was president of that for a few years. She became a member of the Suwannee County Library Board after it was established. She oversaw the local library, which at the time was on the courthouse square in an old house that they converted to use as a library. So she was very socially active. Well, in 1919, 1920, we've got, the 19th Amendment that allows women the right to vote. Goes into effect basically in 1920. So for the first time around the country, women can vote. Now there have been states in regions where women have been able to vote, but nationwide, 1920, when that amendment goes into effect, all women can now vote. So, she doesn't take that newfound right lightly. Not only does she vote, but in 1924 she runs and is elected to become mayor of Live Oak. So 4 years after women get the right to vote, she is now mayor of a major, at the time, major town in Florida. So she serves then. She beats out 3 or 4 other folks, some of whom had been mayor and or would become mayor after her. But she beats out several gentlemen to become mayor. Yeah. She is apparently, from all understandings and all research, she is the first female mayor south of the Mason-Dixon line after universal suffrage. So that's big, happening here in Suwannee County. Let's see. Yeah, she served 1 term, then got out, and then in 1934 she jumped back in and was mayor for another term for a couple of years. So mayor 2 different times in the 1920s and 1930s. But she was still involved in politics. In 1936, she actually was a state delegate at large to the Democratic National Convention that nominated Franklin Roosevelt as president, as his second term anyway, as president. That same year, unfortunately, Dr. Strickland passed away. So she is now a widow in 1936 at the age of, I guess she'd be about 50. She's a widow. After that point, she marries another gentleman named W.L. Giles, who is from Reedsville, Georgia. They are married for 12 years before he dies. She then marries again, and this time it is Arthur Gould of St. Petersburg. And they are married for 7 years when he passes away. So she is widowed 3 times. She stays in St. Petersburg until 1966. She retires. Basically, at that point, she's 80, I guess, comes back to Suwannee County and lives in the Advent Christian Village. Her legacy of political ambitions and politics carries on through her children and grandchildren and such. Her son-in-law is Horry Hare Jr. He becomes, among other things, a state senator. He's also several local offices, but he's a state senator. Her grandson, Maddox Hare, is also a state senator after that. So several generations of politicians in that family. In 1978, it's Live Oak's centennial. Live Oak as a town was not established, but incorporated in 1878. So in 1978, it's the 100th anniversary. It's a big deal, big shindig. And let's see, some of those that are attending include the Lieutenant Governor Jim Williams. And he is supposed to present a centennial birthday cake to the mayor at the time, who was S.T. McDowell. And he's also, supposed to give a big speech, all that good stuff, but he's supposed to present that cake to the mayor, the current then mayor of Live Oak. Well, when he sees Ruby there, he basically gives her the cake because she is the first dignitary that's mentioned. So the lieutenant governor gives the cake to her instead, and then the mayor gets a pair of cufflinks. That's his consolation prize. Here you go. Here's some cufflinks I have. So Ruby got kind of more of an honor than the mayor, current at the time mayor of Live Oak, Mr. McDowell. So Ruby dies in 1985 over in Dowling Park, the Advent Christian Village, at the age of 99. And she's buried in Live Oak Cemetery, and she's buried as Ruby Jordan Strickland Giles Gould. It's got all those last names in there. So I mean, women's history, she's big for the area. Advent Christian Village. I already mentioned earlier, but in 1925, that wooden original building burned. They replaced it with a brick building, with a supposedly fireproof building. And mid-1920s, the raging, you got the swinging 20s, all kinds of good things. People think that money's just going to keep flowing into the United States, and lots of businesses are booming. Lots of tycoons are making money. A Miami real estate tycoon has a lot of money. He says, hey, I'm going to go ahead and tell you, I'll go ahead and pledge lots of money to complete this building. Well, what happens in 1929? stock market crash. These guys, especially the real estate business here in Florida, lose a ton of money. So that building is not completed for several years because that Miami tycoon loses basically his fortune. But eventually it's completed. You can see it there. In 1928, we have one of several floods. And of course, last month we had a little bit of a flood that maybe you might have heard of. Hurricane Debbie. Last year we had a lot of damage from Idalia, Hurricane Idalia. 12 years ago, we had a lot of flooding from Tropical Storm Debbie. So flooding is not unique to 1928. But there was a major flood in that year, and I'll talk about a couple more after that. But in 1928, a major flood. This is, if you will, downtown Dowling Park, showing the flooding there. Cut off a lot of folks. But they survived, they cleaned up, carried on in Dowling Park. This is a map of 1932, circa 1930, but it shows, compared to that other picture I showed you a few minutes ago, look at all these communities on this one. Most of them are gone. Most of them are gone, but you see, of course, Dowling Park with LOP&G still coming from Live Oak. And even some of those communities there, like Wilmarth, Emerson, they weren't going to last too much longer either on this map. So 1928, there's a major flood. 20 years later, ours usually hit about every 20 years. We've been unlucky the last 12 to have 2 of them. But normally it's about every 20 years or so. 1948, there was a major flood. And Ellaville, Dowling Park, Branford, Lurville, a lot of those those riverside communities were hit very hard. At some points, the Suwannee River was 6 miles wide. So that's a lot of flooding. I mean, that's a lot of flooding. This is a photograph, aerial photograph of Dowling Park. You can barely make out LOP&G. That's the railroad depot there that I've already shown a picture of, and that was LOP&G. This is where the river is supposed to be flowing. And you can see here, this is not the bridge. These are box cars that are on top of the bridge to help hold it down so it would not be washed away. That was a common practice. It worked in this case, didn't always work, but it worked in this case. But I mean, this is Dowling Park, Abbott Christian Village. I mean, totally flooded, totally flooded. A lot of these places, all you can see are the roofs sticking out of the water. And in some places, it took a month for that water to recede. So these folks were without houses for a month. Lots of damage. In the 1950s, you've got post-World War II, you've got a economic boom. You've got lots of new construction. And one of those construction projects is to replace this original railroad bridge, vehicle bridge built in the 19-teens, to replace it with a newer bridge. And that one, of course, was there until, a couple years ago, they finally replaced it with an even newer bridge. But this wasn't the only issue. Also, they built the Shuckney Road between Branford and Lake City, things like that. Lots of different civic projects in the 1950s. But the vehicle bridge at Dowling Park was replaced. That's kind of the second era. The 1930s to the very early 1950s is that second generation of vehicle bridge construction in Suwannee County. Unfortunately, in the 1950s, you see an end to the LOP&G as we knew it. After nearly 50 years of service, it is bought out by a different company. I mean, sure, the name is there somewhere buried in the company manual, but you would no longer see Live Oak Perry Mill train eventually going through. Lots of different buyouts. It was no longer locally owned. Abbott Christian Village over the years has continued to grow under 3 generations of Carters now that have been like the director of the village. Now we're under Craig Carter and beyond. So we've got lots of folks that have operated there for multiple generations, helping the Abbott Christian Village not only survive, but grow and thrive, which in turn has allowed Dowling Park to continue to exist, unlike a lot of these other communities that I pointed out. So the African Christian Village continues to operate there. It's its biggest employer of Dowling Park. And that's basically a recent map of the Aberrant Christian Village. So showing the Suwannee River. This is where the Park Hotel was 120 years ago, over here. So lots of this. But if it was not for Aberrant Christian Village, I am sure that Dowling Park would be gone today. It'd be another one of those many, many communities in Suwannee County that cease to exist. But thankfully, the ACV has been able to continue to operate. And that's great. So, I got done right in an hour. I'm shocked. Thank you. Next month, Lord willing, and the creek don't rise or river or anything else, Welborn, we'll talk about. Any questions, comments, thoughts? It helped that I skimmed through the first part of the Indian stuff too. Usually I spend more time, but I realized, you know what, we've talked about this before. I don't need to spend 30 minutes on it. Anyway, so that's Dowling Park. Thank you. I'm glad y'all could attend, and hopefully we'll see y'all and some more folks next month. Appreciate it.